Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Live from COP. I'm Maia Sparkman, Associate Director of Climate Diplomacy at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center. I'm thrilled to be joined here today with Saliem Fakir, Executive Director of the African Climate Foundation, to talk about the developments at COP28 that relates to the climate agenda and energy agenda in Africa. Saliem, thanks so much for joining us today. So to kick us off, I'm wondering if you could share how you're considering what would make this a successful COP.
So there are a couple of areas that I think we need to consider, and it's because this COP is about the global stocktake. So we need to talk about things that are of importance to the continent. Obviously, the Loss and Damage Fund, the announcement, I think they have now close to $500 million of commitment, with the UAE putting a substantial amount. That was announced very early phase, I think on the first day of the COP, which maybe took out a lot of the heat from the debates. The second area is, of course, the fast tracking of the transition. People want specifically a rapid phasing out of oil, gas, and coal. That's another area that we will see a lot of debate. And the third area linked to that, the second one, the continent is still needing a lot of cheaper energy sources. And I think the question for the continent is, what does it do with its vast fossil fuel reserves? And here you'll see a lot of political tension around what the transition on the continent looks like. Because the continent itself is very low emissions. Developing countries are saying there should be some space for them to be able to utilize the remaining carbon budget, which is, I think, 500 gigatons left if you want to meet net zero. The rest of the world has used up to 2,400 gigatons over the last 100 years, mostly US, Europe, and of course China is now taking some of that up. But for us to be able to make the transition, it's not so much about fossil fuels per se, but really about, which is the third issue that I want to talk about, financing of the transition. UNCTAD will release a report today which argues that by 2029 we need $500 million per year. This is what the global target, the new global finance target, needs to look like, which is being negotiated, and Africans are pushing that very hard to ratchet that to about 1.1 trillion in the next couple of years, up to 2050. But for us, it's not just the word finance, but the nature of the finance, the characteristics of the finance. Given that we have high levels of debt on the continent, climate finance ought to have been very concessional or grant, but it's not always the case, as you know. So finance is another one, and then we are very keen as a foundation to innovate in the space of adaptation. So we have a program called Adaptation Resilient Investment Plans. It's really to try to scale up the availability of climate finance and other sources of finance around short-term and long-term adaptation and resilience issues, because climate risk are having a major economic impact on many African countries. So maybe I'll leave it at that. You may want to explore one or two others.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. And so it seems like the three key themes is the Loss and Damage Fund, and then the use of fossil fuels, or just accelerating the transition, especially with that 3 times renewables deployment announcement that the COP28 presidency made as well, that there's a lot of this potential and resources and energy going towards this transition, but it's really your third point is the financing challenge of how to funnel that finance in to be able to implement this development, to reconcile both the economic development opportunities, but also to remain on track with the climate agenda on the continent. And so I kind of want to zoom into the Just Energy Transition Partnership, knowing that you've been involved in this process since the emergence of it back in COP26. And so now that we're sitting here at COP28, there's been so much momentum going into what this Just Energy Transition Partnership is and how this can be a new model of financing for phasing out coal, but also being able to finance energy transitions and energy system transformations in emerging markets. And so I think looking back into COP26, there was the landmark announcement backed by the G7 countries. Then COP27 was the announcement of the investment plan. And so now that we're sitting here at COP28, I'm wondering if you could share what the current status is for at least the Just Energy Transition Partnership in South Africa, and how this can further accelerate progress, and how other countries and emerging markets can who are entering maybe these Just Energy Transition Partnership negotiations, how they can learn from South Africa's experience, and kind of when we'll see the progress of the JETP in South Africa.
So a couple of things on this, because I think this is a very important process, the JETPs. It ties up with how we think about nationally determined contributions. If you remember, Paris had developed an approach of a bottoms-up approach. So South Africa took advantage of that idea of a bottoms-up approach and said, what is our biggest liability? Biggest liability is the carbon that we emit, but it's also the biggest asset, because if we can offset the carbon in a more faster track by mobilizing international resources behind the displacement of at least a gigaton of carbon from the South African system, and then also make a global contribution, we could deliver that outcome at a much cheaper way than many programs for carbon reduction anywhere else in the world, because just of the nature of it. So the NDC ambition was improved before COP26, and the idea of a Just Energy Transition Transaction, which then became the Just Energy Transition Partnership, was conceived as an anchor initiative to lay the groundwork for South Africa to, at least in the mitigation side, find international sources of finance to deliver an outcome that meets several things. One was South Africa needed finance anyway, because it was just coming out of COVID, needed to borrow funds anyway. So it thought of the climate finance as an opportunity to find ways to get cheaper sources of finance. The second part is that we have an energy security problem, and if we could get a big anchor initiative around a large-scale transformation of the electricity sector by expanding cleaner energy sources, that would be a good thing, because one, helps us to deliver, which is the third objective, deliver the carbon emissions that we required to, or we volunteer to do. It's not required, because that's an obligation of the richer countries. And then link that to solving the energy crisis, fast-tracking the decommissioning of older coal plants. One of them is a pilot already. And then I think the fourth element of that is to stimulate new economic development. A couple of things for that, because one is that if you decarbonize, you offset the potential for border tax adjustments or carbon taxes that the European Union and others are looking to put in. That would harm a lot of heavy industries that are dependent on coal. And by bringing cleaner energy source, we lower our carbon footprint. Second thing, investments in cleaner energy plus the grid will no doubt stimulate the economy and create a new investment momentum around new infrastructure that has effects on jobs. And the third is that by improving energy security, we prevent what we call in South Africa, I don't know if you're familiar, load shedding, where every part of the country offsets for 2 or 3 hours, depending on how much power is needed. That has huge economic consequences. It's shutting down a lot of the small businesses. The highest sectors that employ the most people are the small business sector. And many of them, because of load shedding and having to buy generators and so on, the cost of business has gone up. So if you improve energy security with cleaner energy sources, you improve economic, you improve the economic resilience. And fourthly, load shedding and job losses, etc., also leads to higher inflation. So you've got to try to beat all of that. That's what the idea of JETP is, not only to be sourcing climate finance, but reforming the electricity sector and putting the economy back on the right track.
Right. And so I think that a challenge that you're highlighting right now is that the current status of the energy system is that with the load shedding, there's also this job challenge of job loss. But then also with the implementation of the JETP and the transitioning out of coal, there's also going to be job loss. So there's these dual challenges of the current state of play is resulting in job loss, but also as we transition, this will also result in job loss. And so I think, as I've heard of the various conversations here as well at COP, there's still not really a good solution or signal on the best way to build up a workforce to support the transition. And so I'm wondering how COP can better include the social dynamic of the transition, of the energy transition, to be able to achieve the broader goals of the climate agenda.
So I think that this is a very important point you raise, because the COPs don't really talk about jobs and the economy. They always talk about this from a science-based point of view. A lot of it is around emissions and climate risks, but very much around the scientific aspects. There is, of course, on the margins and in some of the embedded discussions, an implicit conversation about economy. Everything here revolves around economic issues. So there has to be more discussion around managed transitions and the implications, socio-economic implications. How we save jobs on one hand, and how we repurpose existing jobs for new kinds of jobs. And the third part is not doing things that are means that we adopt an approach to emissions that is also economically costly. So we have to manage many of these things with the resources we have. But if we get a virtuous cycle right, what might seem as a cost now becomes a point for new growth, and then it can fund itself over the longer term. And I think that's what we need to bring into the NDC debate and into the climate debate. And that's what the foundation tries to do a lot.
Great. And I guess my final question, we focused a lot on the JETPs in South Africa, but I think just zooming out for the continent as a whole, I'm wondering, looking out to COP29, is that COP29, COP30, what's the hope to see as we move forward to be able to ensure that we don't have the same conversation again next year, and instead we actually are seeing more finance being funneled into projects to power a low carbon future in Africa, but also an energy system that can provide economic opportunities and growth as well.
So the COPs are important arena for developing countries. We should not forget the important multilateral institution. But I don't think we'll achieve everything, because usually what happens at a COP, my sense of it is that we gravitate to the lowest denominator. That doesn't really help with ambition. So we have to, there is some discussion, particularly, amongst certain experts, whether we should not reform the COP itself. And as to what that is, I don't really know. So we still have, but at least if there's discussion. I do think there needs to be, and this is where the Atlantic Council and the ACFs of this world can play a role. We also have to look at what can we do outside of the COP, but maintain the key principles of fairness and common but differentiated responsibility, and really begin to deal with more large-scale initiatives that then brings promise and stronger motivation. COPs can be really, for some people outside, it's a talk shop. But if we can bring it every COP, ideas of things that are actually happening on the ground, like we did for JETP, it's the biggest new kind of discussions happen, as you can see. Yeah. It's a very prominent thing now. We have Senegal, Vietnam, and Indonesia. And I think a lot of that kind of initiatives around adaptation and new finance solutions, new kinds of development banks that are very climate focused is where we need to go, and not just rely on words being fixed in the text here.
Yeah, definitely. Well, great. Well, thanks so much for joining us today. Thank you so much, Saliem.
No problem.
And thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you very much.